Some people arrive in history like a comet. They burn bright, they leave a trail, and then they're gone. You can point to where they came from. You can explain what they did. You can file them under a century, a movement, a school of thought. Leonardo da Vinci was not that kind of person. Leonardo da Vinci arrived in history the way a crack appears in a wall, quietly, inexplicably, in a place no one was watching. And then the whole structure changed around him. 500 years after his death, we still don't fully understand what he was. The most sophisticated scientists of our era study his anatomical drawings and find details that weren't confirmed until the 20th century. Engineers build models from his sketches and discover that they work. Neurologists study the structure of his thinking and run out of adequate vocabulary. Art historians look at his paintings and still disagree, fundamentally, about how he did what he did. He was a painter who painted fewer than 20 works in his entire life. And 2 of them are the most famous images in human history. He was a scientist who never published a single paper, and whose notebooks contained discoveries that his era wasn't equipped to use. He was an engineer, an anatomist, a botanist, a musician, a geologist, a cartographer, a hydraulics expert, a weapons designer, and a theatrical set decorator. He was all of these things simultaneously, without apology, without hierarchy among them, without the modern anxiety that demands you choose a lane and stay in it. He was, by most accounts, extraordinarily handsome, physically powerful, and magnetically charming. He was also, by every account, constitutionally unable to finish what he started. He left behind more questions than answers, more notebooks than paintings, more beginnings than endings. And yet, the endings he did complete changed everything. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, not the legend, not the genius as deity that the textbooks hand you and expect you to swallow without chewing. The real man, born illegitimate in a Tuscan hillside town, raised by grandparents, apprenticed at 14, and set loose on a world that had never seen anything like him and hasn't since. This is Art in Ashes. Stay with me. This one is going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. Before we begin, if you're new here, subscribe. Leave a comment telling us what time it is where you are and what brought you to a story about Leonardo da Vinci at this hour. Every comment gets read. Every one. To understand Leonardo da Vinci, you have to start with a word that the 15th century used constantly and that we've almost entirely stopped using because we think we've moved beyond it. The word is illegitimate. On April 15th, 1452, in the small hilltop town of Vinci, in the Tuscan region of what is now Italy, a child was born to a 25-year-old notary named Ser Piero da Vinci and a peasant woman named Caterina. They were not married. They would never marry each other. The child was given his father's first name and the town's name as his surname, Leonardo from Vinci, and recorded in the family's legal documents with a neutrality that conceals the full weight of what it meant to enter the world this way. In 15th century Florence, illegitimacy was not merely a social stigma. It was a legal category with precise and consequential restrictions. The son of an unmarried union could not inherit property from his father in the conventional sense. He could not join the major guilds, the professional associations that controlled entry to law, medicine, and commerce. He could not hold public office. He could not follow his father into the notarial profession, which was the family's livelihood and social standing. What he could do was make art. The guilds that governed painting and sculpture had looser rules about lineage. What they demanded was skill, demonstrable, undeniable, competitive skill. And in this single crack in the rigid social architecture of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci slipped through. He would spend his entire life aware of this entry point. The illegitimacy shaped everything. His obsessive self-reliance, his refusal to cite authorities, his distrust of inherited knowledge, his insistence on testing everything himself with his own eyes and his own hands. He had no institutional inheritance to lean on, so he built his own. Caterina, his mother, disappeared from his life almost immediately. Within a year of Leonardo's birth, Ser Piero had made a socially appropriate marriage to a woman named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori. Caterina married a local laborer named Acarabriga, a nickname that translates roughly as troublemaker, and moved a short distance away to raise a second family. Leonardo was raised first by his paternal grandparents, then primarily by his uncle Francesco, a gentle, curious man who farmed the family land and who seems to have been the first adult in Leonardo's life who simply let him observe the world without demanding that the observation produce something useful. Uncle Francesco took walks, and Leonardo walked with him. Through the Tuscan hills, along the banks of the Arno, through the olive groves and vineyards that terraced the hillsides above Vinci. And Leonardo looked at the movement of water over rocks, at the spiral unfurling of a fern, at the precise way light changed the color of stone at different hours, at the behavior of birds in the moment before flight. Later in life, Leonardo would fill thousands of notebook pages with observations of these exact phenomena. But the habit of looking, the almost pathological attention to the visible world, began here, on walks with an uncle who had nowhere particular to be. His father, Ser Piero, had noticed by the time Leonardo was around 12 or 13 that the boy had a talent for drawing that went beyond the ordinary. The notebooks of the period are lost, but the family tradition records that Leonardo drew with a naturalness and accuracy that stopped adults in their tracks. So Ser Piero did what the era's social logic recommended. He gathered samples of his son's work and traveled to Florence to show them to the most respected artist in the city. That artist was Andrea del Verrocchio. And when Verrocchio saw what the boy from Vinci had drawn, he took him on immediately. Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop in Florence in the late 1460s was not merely a place where paintings and sculptures were made. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the most advanced visual research laboratory in the Western world. Verrocchio was a goldsmith, sculptor, and painter of exceptional technical skill and intellectual rigor. His workshop operated on commission, producing altarpieces, portraits, bronze sculptures, decorative objects, and ceremonial items for the Medici family and the Florentine elite. But beyond the commercial work, it was a place where problems were studied, where the question of how to represent drapery falling across a human body, or how to cast a large bronze figure without losing structural integrity, or how to render the surface of water in a way that captured its actual visual behavior, were treated as serious problems worthy of systematic investigation. Leonardo arrived as an apprentice around 1466, when he was approximately 14 years old. Under the guild system of the time, this was the standard entry point for a career in the visual arts. Years of grinding pigments, preparing panels, studying the master's technique, gradually being trusted with small sections of commissioned works until sufficient skill was demonstrated to take on independent projects. What the standard guild progression did not account for was an apprentice like Leonardo. Within a few years of his arrival, it became apparent to everyone in the workshop that the boy from Vinci was not going to follow the standard progression. He was not going to learn Verrocchio's technique, absorb it faithfully, and then execute commissions in his master's style for the rest of his working life. He was going to do something else entirely, something that the workshop's vocabulary didn't have a precise name for. He was going to look at everything and then start over from the beginning. The story most commonly told about Leonardo's time in Verrocchio's workshop involves a painting called The Baptism of Christ. Verrocchio had been commissioned to produce it, and, as was standard practice, various members of the workshop contributed to different sections. Leonardo was assigned the leftmost angel, a secondary figure, partially behind another angel, meant to observe the central scene. The angel Leonardo painted is so far beyond the quality of everything surrounding it that art historians have used it for centuries as a visual demonstration of what it actually looks like when a genius enters a field. The other figures in the painting, Verrocchio's own work and competent work by any reasonable standard, appear, in comparison, to belong to a different era entirely. Leonardo's angel has a quality that the 15th century's technical vocabulary didn't quite have words for: psychological presence. The sense that this figure has an inner life that continues beyond the frame of the painting, that it was thinking, feeling, perceiving something in the moment the painter caught it. The legend that follows, that Verrocchio, upon seeing the angel, put down his brushes and declared he would never paint again because his student had already surpassed him, is almost certainly embellished. But the kernel of truth it contains is real. Verrocchio recognized what he had in his workshop, and his response was not resentment or competition. It was the response of a genuinely great teacher. He got out of the way. Florence in the 1470s was perhaps the most intellectually extraordinary city in Europe. The Medici family, Lorenzo de' Medici in particular, who would earn the title Lorenzo the Magnificent not as flattery but as description, had turned the city into a gathering point for philosophers, poets, humanists, and artists of a density and ambition that hadn't been seen in Europe since ancient Athens. The Platonic Academy that met at Lorenzo's villa outside the city was not a formal institution with enrolled students and a fixed curriculum. It was a conversation, ongoing, unstructured, and enormous in its scope, about the nature of reality, the relationship between the divine and the human, the meaning of beauty, and the possibility of a unified knowledge that could encompass both the arts and the sciences. Leonardo was not a full member of this circle. His background, illegitimate, non-Latin reading until well into adulthood, trained as an artisan rather than as a scholar, placed him on the edges of the intellectual aristocracy rather than at its center. But the atmosphere of the city was his education in ways that no classroom could have replicated. He read voraciously in Italian translation, Euclid, Pliny, Alberti, the natural philosophy texts that were beginning to circulate in humanist editions. He attended dissections when he could. He talked to engineers, hydraulics experts, military architects, merchants who had traveled to the Near East and brought back observations about optics and astronomy. He collected information the way other men collected debts, compulsively, indiscriminately, with the constant sensation that there was always more to know. And he painted. In 1478, 2 years after becoming an independent master, Leonardo received his first independent commission, a large altarpiece for the chapel of the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's city hall. He began work on it, produced extensive preparatory drawings, and then stopped. left it unfinished. The commission was eventually given to someone else. This was the first documented instance of a pattern that would follow Leonardo for the rest of his life and baffle every patron, every employer, every colleague, and every biographer who has tried to make sense of it. Leonardo da Vinci almost never finished what he started. The reasons for this are complex and have been debated for 5 centuries. Some historians emphasize the perfectionism, the sense that no execution could ever fully capture what the preparatory thinking had imagined. Some point to the hyperactivity of his curiosity, which was always pulling him toward the next problem before the current one was resolved. Some suggest a deeper psychological pattern, rooted perhaps in the fundamental instability of his early life, a man who had learned that beginnings were safer than endings, because endings could be judged. What is certain is that the unfinished works are not evidence of laziness or failure. The drawings that preceded and accompanied every project Leonardo abandoned are, in many cases, more intellectually extraordinary than the finished paintings of his contemporaries. The process was the achievement. The destination was almost beside the point. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence and moved to Milan. He was 30 years old. He had a modest reputation as a painter of exceptional but incomplete work, a growing reputation as an engineer and designer of theatrical spectacles, and a letter of introduction to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, that he had written himself. The letter is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of self-presentation. Leonardo lists his qualifications for the Duke's service in 10 numbered points. Points 1 through 9 describe his abilities as a military engineer, his designs for portable bridges, techniques for draining moats, methods of constructing covered assault vehicles, designs for mortars, catapults, and armored vehicles. He describes ships capable of withstanding artillery. He describes methods for underground tunneling beneath enemy fortifications. Point 10, almost as an afterthought, mentions that he can also paint and sculpt. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. The man we now know primarily as the painter of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper presented himself to his prospective employer first and foremost as a weapons engineer, not out of false modesty about his art, but because he genuinely understood himself as something larger than any single discipline, as a person whose core skill was not painting or engineering or anatomy, but thinking. Applied, systematic, ruthlessly empirical thinking about how the world actually worked. He got the job. The 17 years Leonardo spent in Milan under Ludovico Sforza's patronage were the most productive of his life, and in many ways, the most revealing of his actual nature. He designed court pageants and theatrical sets of spectacular complexity. He worked on the design of the Milan Cathedral's dome. He produced elaborate hydraulic engineering plans for the city's canal system. He designed a massive equestrian monument to Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, that would have been the largest bronze casting in the world, and spent years on the clay model before the project was abandoned when the bronze was diverted for military cannon. He painted the Virgin of the Rocks. He painted the portraits of Ludovico's mistresses, including the extraordinary Cecilia Gallerani, lady with an ermine, whose subject looks out of the frame with a psychological complexity that no portrait painter before Leonardo had achieved, and very few after him. And he painted, on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the work that many consider the most studied painting in human history. The Last Supper. To understand what the Last Supper did to the history of art, You have to understand what a Last Supper painting was before Leonardo made one. The subject was among the most frequently commissioned in Italian religious art. Every major church, monastery, and convent in northern Italy wanted one for its dining hall. The symbolic logic of monks or nuns eating their meals in the presence of Christ's final meal with his apostles was too perfect to resist. There were dozens of them. Competent, reverent, technically accomplished works that depicted 12 men and a central figure arranged at a long table, frozen in the gravity of a sacred moment. What Leonardo did with the subject was so different from everything that had come before that art historians still reach for the word revolutionary with genuine rather than habitual conviction. He chose to depict not the moment of the Eucharist, the bread and wine, the established sacramental iconography that tradition and patronage expected, but a different moment entirely. The moment immediately after Christ says, "One of you will betray me." Leonardo depicted the reaction. He depicted 12 distinct human beings, not religious archetypes, not symbolic figures in devotional poses, receiving this announcement and responding to it in 12 completely individual ways. Some lean forward with outrage. Some pull back in shock. Some reach toward Christ in protest. Some turn to their neighbors. One, Judas, pulls back, his face in shadow, his hand moving involuntarily toward the bag of coins at his belt. The psychological differentiation Leonardo achieved in this work is, even by modern standards, staggering. He had studied human faces for years, sketching reactions to extreme emotion in the streets of Milan, attending executions and court proceedings to record the specific physiological expressions of fear, grief, anger, and guilt. He had filled notebooks with these studies, and now, in this single commission, he deployed them all. The work took 3 years. It was done not in true fresco, the technique of painting on wet plaster that the era's best wall painters used, but in a mixed technique of oil and tempera on dry plaster that Leonardo had developed himself. It was a technical experiment, and it began to deteriorate within 20 years of completion. Today, what we see in Santa Maria delle Grazie is barely 20% original Leonardo. The rest is centuries of restoration, repainting, and conservation. And yet, even in this condition, this faded, damaged, repeatedly restored fragment of the original, it stops people. It stops people who don't know anything about art history. It stops people who have seen photographs of it 100 times. It stops people who are not religious, who have no particular feeling for the subject, who came to Milan for completely different reasons. It stops them because Leonardo managed to encode something into the spatial and psychological architecture of this image that does not require any context to receive. The sense that something irreversible has just been set in motion, that a particular kind of human drama, the drama of trust broken, of betrayal conceived, of consequences that cannot be recalled, is unfolding in real time, in that room, at that table, among those 12 specific, individual, irreplaceable human beings. Leonardo painted it so that you would feel it, before you understood it. That is not a skill that can be taught. It is not a technique that can be reverse engineered. 500 years of trying has confirmed this. The notebooks. Somewhere between 7,000 and 13,000 pages of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks survive. Nobody knows the precise number because they are scattered across libraries and collections on 4 continents in varying states of preservation with disputed attributions and complex provenance histories. The ones that have been studied and published are extraordinary enough. the ones that have not yet been fully analyzed may contain additional surprises. The ones that were lost, and many were lost, in the chaos of the decades after his death, represent a gap in the history of human knowledge that cannot be measured, because we don't know what fell into it. What the surviving notebooks contain is not a coherent system. It is not a treatise or a series of treatises or an encyclopedia, despite several attempts by Leonardo himself to organize his material into publishable form. It is something more chaotic and more interesting than any of those things. It is a mind thinking in real time. Leonardo wrote in his notebooks the way other people think in the shower, compulsively, associatively, following connections wherever they led without worrying about where they were going. A page on the hydraulics of water flowing around an obstacle gives way without transition to a sketch of a bird's wing anatomy, which connects to a diagram of a proposed flying machine, which is interrupted by a shopping list, which is followed by a meditation on the nature of shadows. He wrote in mirror script, from right to left, in a hand that required a mirror to read easily. The reasons for this are debated. Some historians suggest it was a deliberate code to protect his ideas from casual reading. Others believe it was simply the natural preference of a left-handed person who had taught himself to write. What's certain is that it created, in the notebooks, an additional layer of intimacy, the sense that you are genuinely in the presence of a private mind, not a public document. The anatomical notebooks deserve their own moment of attention. Beginning in the 1480s and continuing through the last decade of his life, Leonardo conducted dissections of human cadavers. Some estimates suggest he dissected between 30 and 50 bodies over the course of his career. This was not unusual for an artist of the period. Understanding human anatomy was considered fundamental to representing the human figure accurately, and dissection was practiced, if not entirely openly, by several of Leonardo's contemporaries. What was entirely unusual was what Leonardo did with what he found. He didn't sketch the general shapes of organs and muscles for the purpose of painting better bodies. He investigated the specific mechanical function of each structure, how the heart's valves opened and closed, how the muscles of the hand coordinated to produce the grip, how the layers of the abdominal wall overlapped, how the branching structure of the bronchial tubes followed a mathematical pattern that also appeared in the branching structure of rivers. His drawing of the cardiovascular system, executed in the first decade of the 16th century, is anatomically accurate to a degree that required no correction when modern medicine finally examined it in the 19th and 20th centuries. His understanding of arteriosclerosis, the hardening of arterial walls, preceded the formal medical description of the condition by 300 years. His studies of the fetus in the womb, executed between approximately 1510 and 1513, are so accurate in their representation of the fetal position, the structure of the placenta, and the relationship between fetal and maternal circulation that they could, with minor additions, appear in a modern obstetrics textbook. None of this was published in his lifetime. None of it was known to the scientists and physicians who were working on the same problems in the following 2 centuries. The notebooks sat in private collections, were scattered across Europe after his death, and were not systematically studied until the 19th century, by which point science had independently arrived at most of the same conclusions through different paths, at different speeds, at great cost in time and effort. This is one of the most haunting facts about Leonardo da Vinci. The knowledge he had accumulated and failed to publish and left locked in private notebooks written in mirror script would have accelerated the history of medicine by decades, possibly by a century. He knew it. He wrote in the notebooks explicit plans to compile his anatomical observations into a systematic treatise for the use of future painters and surgeons. He described exactly what such a work would contain. He never finished it. In 1499, the French army invaded Milan. Ludovico Sforza fled the city. Leonardo's patronage, his workshop, his stable income, and the ambitious projects he had been pursuing for 17 years collapsed overnight. He was 47 years old. He packed his notebooks, his drawings, and his portable property into trunks and left Milan. He would spend the next several years moving between courts and cities, Venice, Mantua, Florence again, Rome, and eventually France, in a pattern that looks from the outside like a man in search of the one patron generous and patient enough to fund the kind of work he actually wanted to do. He never quite found that patron. Or rather, he found several who came close, and each time the arrangement eventually broke down under the weight of Leonardo's inability to deliver what he had promised on the schedule he had agreed to in the form that had been commissioned. He returned to Florence around 1500 and almost immediately received two of the most prestigious commissions in the city: a large altarpiece for the Servite monks of Santissima Annunziata, and a commission from the Florentine government for a large battle painting in the new council chamber of the Palazzo della Signoria. The altarpiece produced a preparatory cartoon, a full-scale drawing, that was exhibited publicly and caused what contemporary sources describe as a sensation. People came from across the city to see it. They stood in front of it for hours. It is one of the earliest documented instances in Western art of a purely preparatory work, not a finished painting, not even intended as the final product, generating the kind of public response usually reserved for completed masterpieces. Then Leonardo abandoned the commission, left it unfinished. The monks, after waiting, gave it to someone else. The battle painting, the Battle of Anghiari, meant to face Michelangelo's Battle of Cassina on the opposite wall of the same chamber, was begun, partially executed, and then abandoned when the experimental painting technique Leonardo was using began to fail before the work was complete. What survived was eventually covered over. Copies of the central section, made by other artists while the work was still visible, give some sense of what was lost: a tangle of horses and men locked in combat of an energy and psychological violence that contemporaries described as unlike anything they had seen. It is gone. Another lost Leonardo. Another fragment of a larger vision that the world glimpsed briefly, and then lost. It was somewhere in this period, the early years of the 16th century, probably between 1503 and 1519, that Leonardo was working on the painting that would eventually become the most recognized image in the history of human civilization. The portrait of a woman, probably the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, that we know as the Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda, or La Joconde. She has been called many things in many languages, and each name carries slightly different connotations, the Italian suggesting her identity as Giocondo's wife, the French suggesting a kind of playfulness that the Italian doesn't quite intend. What nobody calls her, in any language, is finished. Leonardo carried the painting with him for the rest of his life. He worked on it for years. Some estimates say he was still adding glazes and adjustments in the final year before his death. He never delivered it to the client. He never sold it. It traveled with him to France when he accepted the invitation of King Francis I in 1516 and spent his last 3 years at the Château de Clos-Lucé near Amboise. When he died in 1519, the Mona Lisa was still in his possession. Francis I acquired it shortly after. Possibly, he had already been promised it, or simply claimed it as the natural consequence of his patron relationship with the man who had made it. It became part of the French royal collection and eventually, after the Revolution, part of the permanent collection of the Louvre, where it remains. Bolted to the wall behind bulletproof glass, protected by a security apparatus that treats it with roughly the same degree of care as a head of state, visited by approximately 10 million people per year who press forward in crowds 3 deep to hold up their phones and take a photograph of something they have already seen 10,000 times in reproduction. The irony that Leonardo, who almost never finished anything, who spent his entire career infuriating patrons with his inability to deliver, produced the single most reproduced image in the history of art, is so complete that it feels less like coincidence than like the universe making a point. What makes the Mona Lisa what it is has been the subject of more analysis, more speculation, more scientific testing, and more outright nonsense than any other work of art in existence. Entire books have been devoted to the identity of the sitter, the meaning of the smile, the composition of the glazes, the hidden geometry, the symbolic program, the neurological basis of the viewer's response. The bibliography is essentially infinite. What can be said with confidence is this: Leonardo used, in the Mona Lisa, a technique he had been developing for decades, and that reached its fullest expression in this painting. He called it sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke. It is a method of modeling form not through clearly defined outlines, but through the gradual, almost imperceptible blending of tones at the edges of shapes, so that the boundary between one form and another is never entirely where you expect it to be. The sfumato in the Mona Lisa is so fine, applied in dozens of thin, translucent layers of oil glaze over years of work, that modern analysis using X-ray fluorescence and infrared reflectography has revealed the individual layers to be thinner than a human hair. Each one, dozens of them, applied with a brush or with the tip of a finger or with some tool that has left no trace anyone has yet been able to identify. The effect this produces in the finished painting is that nothing in it is entirely fixed. The features of the face, particularly the mouth and the eyes, seem to shift slightly depending on where the viewer's gaze is directed. When you look directly at the mouth, it seems neutral. When your attention moves to her eyes, the corners of the mouth appear to lift. The smile resolves and dissolves depending on how you're looking. This is not accidental. It is not a side effect of age or deterioration or trick of light in the gallery. It is engineered. Leonardo understood from his studies of optics and human vision that peripheral vision processes contrast and shadow differently from direct vision. He designed the painting to exploit this differential, to produce a face that functions differently depending on what the viewer is doing with their eyes in any given moment. He made a painting that responds to being looked at. The woman in it is always doing something slightly different. She is not quite doing the same thing she was doing a moment ago. She will not quite be doing the same thing when you look again. In 500 years, nobody has been able to fully duplicate this effect. They have come close. They have described it, analyzed it, reverse engineered its technical components. But the thing itself, the specific quality of presence that the Mona Lisa has, and that no copy or analysis has ever entirely captured, remains, in some fundamental sense, inexplicable, which may be the most Leonardo da Vinci thing about it. There is a dimension of Leonardo's life that most of the popular biographies handle awkwardly, if they handle it at all. Not because the information is unavailable, it has been documented for centuries, but because it requires sitting with a version of Leonardo that is less comfortable than the pure genius narrative. In 1476, when Leonardo was 24 years old and still working in Verrocchio's workshop, he was anonymously denounced to the officers of the night, the Florentine magistracy responsible for prosecuting sodomy, for having sexual relations with a male model named Jacopo Saltarelli. The charge was serious. Sodomy in 15th century Florence was a capital offense, at least in theory, though the actual application of the law was inconsistent. The case was investigated twice, and both times discharged for lack of evidence or witnesses willing to testify. Leonardo was released without penalty. He never married. He formed no documented romantic attachments to women, despite spending much of his adult life in courts and cities full of beautiful, available, and socially ambitious women who would have considered an attachment to the most famous artist in Italy a significant advantage. He surrounded himself throughout his adult life with young male assistants and apprentices, some of whom he kept in his household for years, supported financially, and left substantial bequests to in his will. The most significant of these relationships was with a young man named Gian Giacomo Caproti, known as Salai, a nickname that translates as Little Devil, who entered Leonardo's household in 1490 at approximately the age of 10 and remained associated with him for nearly 30 years. By Leonardo's own account in the notebooks, Salai was difficult, dishonest, vain, and expensive. He stole money from Leonardo repeatedly. He ruined paintings. He consumed resources without producing anything of equivalent value. Leonardo kept him anyway, left him paintings in the will, and, in a notebook entry whose affectionate tone is unmistakable, described him as having hair that curled like a spiral and eyes that sparkled. What exactly the relationship was between Leonardo and Salai, and between Leonardo and Francesco Melzi, the young nobleman who joined his household in 1506 and who was, by all accounts, the most devoted companion of Leonardo's final years, is a question the historical record does not answer definitively. The emotional texture of the available evidence suggests something more complex than a simple employer-apprentice dynamic. But the nature of that complexity cannot be stated with certainty, and historians who have tried to state it with certainty in either direction have generally overstepped what the evidence actually supports. What can be said is this: Leonardo was a man who loved men, who found, in the company of young male apprentices and companions, something that the official structures of his era did not permit him to name or fully inhabit, and who lived his emotional life in the same way he lived his intellectual life, privately, obliquely, in the margins of notebooks written in mirror script, in portraits of people whose identities he never disclosed, in a smile painted so carefully that it refuses to resolve into a single expression. The last years of Leonardo's life were spent in France as the guest, effectively the court artist, though he produced little, of King Francis I. He was installed in the Château du Clos Lucé, connected by an underground tunnel to the royal residence at Amboise, so that the king could visit him whenever he wished. Francis I was 21 years old when he became King of France. He was everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be: young, handsome, militarily vigorous, and possessed of a genuine intellectual and aesthetic curiosity that set him apart from most of his contemporaries. He had seen Italian art on his military campaigns in Italy, and what he had seen had not simply impressed him, it had obsessed him. He wanted the best of it for France. Leonardo arrived in France in 1516 at the age of 64. He had suffered a stroke at some point. The exact timing is uncertain, that had partially paralyzed his right hand. He could no longer paint with the dexterity the work demanded. He continued drawing with his left hand, continued making notes and plans, continued the great projects of compilation and systematization that he had been promising himself and the world for decades, and that would, once again, remain unfinished. He designed spectacular court pageants for Francis. He worked on hydraulic engineering plans for the Loire Valley. He may have made finishing touches on the Mona Lisa, the St. John the Baptist, and the St. Anne during these years, the paintings that had traveled with him to France and that he could not bring himself to part with. And he talked to Francis. The testimony of those who witnessed the relationship between the old painter and the young king is consistent on one point. Francis listened to Leonardo the way very few people had been willing to listen to him in his long career. Not as a patron waiting for a promised work to be delivered, not as a patron calculating the political value of a famous name at court, but as a student sits with a teacher who is running out of time. Contemporary accounts record the king saying more than once that he believed no man had ever been born who knew as much as Leonardo, that the conversations about painting, philosophy, nature, and mathematics that he had with Leonardo were unlike anything he had experienced in a life that had not been short on remarkable experiences. On May 2nd, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at the Château de Clos-Lucé. He was 67 years old. The legend, probably embellished, but preserved in Vasari's account and in the French royal tradition, says that Francis I was at his bedside when he died, and that the old man died in the king's arms. Whether or not this is literally true, the image it contains is accurate to something real. The most curious mind in the history of Western civilization, at the end held by the most powerful man in Europe, who simply did not want to let the conversation end. He left behind, to Francesco Melzi, all of his notebooks and papers. Melzi spent the rest of his own long life trying to organize them into publishable form, a treatise on painting that was partially compiled from the relevant passages and eventually published in a form that satisfied nobody, decades after Melzi's own death. The anatomical notebooks were not published systematically until the 19th century. The engineering designs were not built until the 20th, when reconstructions demonstrated, with some surprise, that they worked. The flying machine designs, the ornithopter, the aerial screw, the hang glider, were not technically feasible with the materials available to Leonardo, but they were conceptually sound. They were thinking in the right direction. They were the work of someone who understood what flight required, even if the technology to achieve it was 4 centuries away. The hydraulic designs were partly built during his lifetime and partly abandoned. The canal projects, the water management systems, the flood control proposals, many of them were revisited by engineers in subsequent centuries who, examining the problems independently, arrived at solutions very similar to Leonardo's. His studies of geology, the recognition that the fossil shells embedded in the mountains above Vinci were evidence of ancient seabeds, that the earth had a history of transformation far longer than scripture suggested, that the present landscape was the product of processes unimaginably slow and ancient, anticipated the foundational concepts of geology by 300 years. His studies of optics, of the behavior of light and shadow, of the way the eye processes visual information, these fed directly into his painting practice, which is why his paintings look the way they look. But they also contained observations that physicists and neuroscientists are still citing in the 21st century. The question that haunts Leonardo's legacy, that has haunted it since within a generation of his death, when people began to understand the scale of what was in those notebooks, is not the usual question asked about great artists. The usual question is, how did you make something so beautiful? The question Leonardo leaves behind is different. How did you know so much? And why didn't you tell anyone? The answer to the first question remains, in some final sense, unanswerable. The available explanations, the illegitimate birth that forced self-reliance, the uncle who taught him to look, the apprenticeship in the world's best workshop, the decades of obsessive empirical investigation are all necessary but not sufficient. They explain the preconditions. They do not explain the thing itself. The answer to the second question, why he didn't publish, why he didn't compile, why the knowledge stayed locked in private notebooks in mirror script, is probably simpler and sadder than the theories that have been proposed. He was always going to do it next. The compilation of the anatomy treatise was always going to happen after the equestrian monument. The synthesis of the engineering principles was always going to happen after the canal project. The publication of the optics research was always going to happen after the battle painting. The organization of the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime was always going to happen when there was a period of stability, a reliable patron, a clean run of uninterrupted time. There was never a clean run of uninterrupted time. There was Milan, and then the French invasion. There was Florence, and then the abandonment of the battle painting. There was Rome, and then the intrigues of lesser artists who worked to undermine him. There was France, and then the stroke. There was always a reason why the great synthesis would have to wait a little longer. And then, there was no more time. 5 centuries after Leonardo da Vinci's death, the questions his life raises are not historical curiosities. They are alive in ways that speak directly to the anxieties of the present moment. We live in an era that worships specialization, that has built its entire educational and professional infrastructure around the principle that mastery requires narrowing. That has made the generalist, the person who refuses to choose a lane and stay in it, into an object of mild suspicion, someone who probably hasn't committed, who probably hasn't gone deep enough, who probably lacks the discipline to do the hard work of genuine expertise. Leonardo da Vinci was the most extreme refutation of this principle that history has produced. His mastery was not despite his breadth, it was because of it. The understanding of hydraulics informed the painting of water. The understanding of anatomy informed the painting of bodies. The understanding of optics informed the painting of light. The understanding of botany informed the painting of plants. The understanding of geology informed the painting of landscapes. Everything fed everything else in a network of mutual reinforcement that produced a quality of visual knowledge no specialist could have achieved, because no specialist had access to all the inputs. He was not a painter who also knew some science. He was a thinker who used painting as one of many instruments for investigating the nature of things. The distinction matters enormously. The second thing Leonardo's life raises is the question of what we lose when knowledge is not shared. We have become, in the 5 centuries since Leonardo, extraordinarily good at the mechanics of knowledge transmission. We have journals, universities, the internet, open source databases, preprint servers, international conferences. We have systems designed specifically to ensure that what is discovered is communicated, that the insights of one mind become available to all minds as quickly as possible before they can be lost. We built these systems partly because of what happened to Leonardo's notebooks, partly because of the catastrophe of watching 3,000 pages of original scientific discovery sit in a box in a nobleman's house in Lombardy for a century, while medicine killed patients for lack of information that was already available, already written down, already illustrated with extraordinary precision, if only anyone had thought to look. We built these systems because genius, unshared, is only potential. And yet, even with all the systems we have built, we lose things. Knowledge accumulates in institutions and does not cross disciplinary lines. Insights developed in one field sit unknown to the researchers in the adjacent field who need them. The notebooks of our era are not leather-bound volumes in mirror script. They are hard drives, email archives, unfinished draft papers, discarded grant proposals. The information is stored. It just isn't shared. Leonardo would have recognized the problem immediately. He would also, probably, have had a detailed sketch of the solution somewhere in a notebook. Surrounded by shopping lists and observations about the behavior of water. There is one more thing to say about Leonardo da Vinci. Something that the grand narrative of genius and discovery tends to leave out, because it is smaller and quieter than the rest of the story, but which may be the most humanly important thing about him. He was lonely. Not in the acute sense. He was never without company, never without assistants and apprentices and patrons and well-wishers in the social life of whatever court he was attached to. He was a brilliant conversationalist, physically attractive, skilled at performance and entertainment, capable of commanding a room. But in the notebook entries where the defensive formality of a document intended for outside eyes drops away completely, you find a person who experienced a persistent, bone-deep isolation, who knew that what he was seeing and thinking had no adequate audience, who wrote in several places explicit laments about the impossibility of communicating the full complexity of what he had observed, about the gap between the thing seen and the thing said, between the understanding achieved and the understanding transmitted. He wrote, "If you are alone, you belong entirely to yourself. If you are accompanied by even one companion, you belong only half to yourself." He wrote, "Iron rusts from disuse, stagnant water loses its purity, and in cold weather becomes frozen. Even so does inaction sap the vigors of the mind." He wrote, "While I thought that I was learning how to live, I have been learning how to die." These are not the observations of a man who has found his place in the world and is content. They are the observations of a man who has spent his whole life running towards something, some unified understanding, some complete synthesis, some final resolution of all the questions the universe kept raising. And who knows, in his honest moments, that he is not going to reach it, that nobody reaches it, that the notebooks will remain unfinished, that the treatises will remain unwritten, that the paintings will remain incomplete, that the distance between what you see and what you can show, what you know and what you can say, is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived. He lived it for 67 years. He lived it with a curiosity and a discipline and a dedication to looking that the world has never equaled. And at the end, he gave what he had to a young French king who sat by his bed and didn't want the conversation to stop. It stopped anyway. It always does. What remains, the notebooks, the paintings, the engineering designs, the anatomical studies, the optics research, the fragments and the masterpieces, and the abandoned commissions and the mirror script shopping lists, is not a body of work. It is a body of attention. The record of one human being paying attention to the world with more sustained intensity than any human being before or since. And the strange, persistent, unreasonable hope it leaves behind is this: that somewhere, right now, someone is looking at something in the way Leonardo looked at things, without fear of where the looking leads, without anxiety about which discipline it belongs to, without the modern insistence that you choose a lane and stay in it. Someone is looking at the way water moves around a stone, or the way a bird holds its wing in the moment before flight, or the way light falls on a human face, and seeing something that everyone else has seen and no one has fully understood. And maybe this time, they'll write it down and share it. I hope this story kept you company tonight. If you've made it to the end of this one, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The curious, the patient, the people who choose depth over noise at whatever hour of the night it happens to be. This is Art and Ashes, your companion for late nights and long questions. If this story gave you something, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Which detail surprised you most? Which Leonardo, the painter, the scientist, the engineer, the lonely man writing in mirror script, feels most real to you? And tell us what historical figure you want us to explore next. Every comment gets read. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.